They hired a human to watch their children because humans were considered harmless, adaptable, emotional, easy to control. Then the cubs challenged her dominance, and the parents realized they hadn't hired help. They had invited a predator into their home. The Varethi residence floated above a violet gas giant, a palace grown from living crystal and reinforced with military-grade shielding. It was designed to endure orbital bombardment and atmospheric storms that could strip metal from stone. Inside, however, the most heavily secured chamber was not a war room. It was the nursery. Varethi young were not fragile beings. They were born with reinforced bone structures, layered muscle density, and instinctive dominance responses that surfaced within their first growth cycle. Their roars were not mere sounds. They were biological pressure waves meant to establish hierarchy and discourage threat. Among their species, a cub that failed to assert itself early rarely survived to maturity. Caretakers, RAREL, why lasted long. When the council liaison suggested hiring a human, the parents accepted for one reason: humans possessed endurance. Their biology tolerated stress conditions most species avoided. Their emotional responses made them attentive. Their reputation for empathy suggested they would nurture without provoking instinctual challenge. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, observational, controlled. Her name was Mara Van Stott. She arrived without ceremony, carrying no visible equipment beyond a small pack and a translation band at her wrist. She walked through defensive checkpoints without hesitation, her posture calm but alert, her eyes taking in structural angles, exits, environmental shifts. The security personnel noted the behavior as cautious. The parents noticed something else. She observed the space the way a strategist observes terrain. The cubs were already watching when she entered. 3 of them, each nearly half her height, even at early development stage, stood at the center of the chamber. Their scales reflected faint amber light. Their eyes were bright, unblinking. Their tails moved slowly, not in agitation, but in calculation. They did not approach her as young seeking attention. They circled. Mara did not retreat. She lowered her stance slightly, placing herself at their eye level. Her movements were unhurried. She spoke softly through the translation band, not attempting authority, only acknowledgement. Her tone carried a steady rhythm. Not submission, not challenge, presence. The cubs responded the only way they understood. The first roar shook the nursery's structural supports. It was not directed at her alone. It was a declaration, a statement of territory, of instinct, of inherited dominance that had defined their species for generations. Energy rippled through the chamber, activating passive dampening fields along the walls. Mara did not move. Observation panels beyond the chamber transmitted the scene to the parents' private gallery. They watched closely, expecting compliance. They expected the human to step back, lower her gaze, accept position. That was the protocol for non-Varethi within juvenile proximity. Instead, Mara adjusted her footing and exhaled slowly, as if aligning breath with pressure. The second cub advanced, its claws tapping against the crystal floor. It released a sharper roar, shorter but more focused. A test, a demand. The third circled behind her, completing the instinctive formation used to establish dominance through enclosure. Security systems registered, escalating stress within the chamber's acoustic field. Automated protocols prepared to intervene if biological thresholds were exceeded. The parents allowed the process to continue. Early assertion was expected. It was healthy. It was necessary. Mara's eyes moved from one cub to the next, not rapidly, not nervously. She tracked their motion the way experienced handlers track animals larger than themselves. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing deepened. When she spoke again, the translation band failed to interpret the sound correctly. It was not language. It was tone. The cubs paused. Confusion lasted only a moment. Instinct reclaimed control. All three released a unified roar that vibrated through the entire structure. Shockwaves rippled across the chamber's surface. Dust rose from structural seams. The pressure was meant to overwhelm, to force retreat, to finalize hierarchy. Mara remained exactly where she stood. Silence followed, brief but heavy. The cubs waited for submission. They had never witnessed anything else. Then Mara inhaled. What followed was not imitation. It was not defiance shaped by anger. It was something older, something carried in the deep structure of human survival. Her voice did not merely produce sound. It carried intention sharpened by discipline, anchored by control, amplified by a physiology accustomed to enduring force without surrender. Her roar filled the chamber. It was not louder by volume alone. It was structured, layered, sustained. The acoustic dampeners struggled to stabilize the wave. Vibrations traveled through support frameworks into the outer shell of the residence. Observation panels flickered momentarily under resonant strain. Inside the nursery, the cubs froze. Their instincts had no category for what they experienced. The sound did not communicate threat alone. It communicated presence that could not be displaced, authority that did not require recognition, a boundary that did not request acceptance. The parents stood without realizing they had risen. Within the chamber, Mara lowered her voice gradually until silence returned under her control, not the cubs. She did not step forward. She did not advance dominance through movement. She allowed the absence of sound to hold its weight. The cubs shifted. Their posture changed not into submission, but into awareness. They had encountered something their instincts had not predicted, a being that did not challenge for territory, yet could not be pushed from it. Security systems recorded stable conditions. Structural integrity remained intact. No harm had occurred. Yet the atmosphere within the chamber had transformed completely. From the observation gallery, the parents did not immediately re-enter the room. For the first time since the cub's birth cycle began, someone had answered instinct with certainty rather than fear. The realization formed slowly but undeniably. They had not hired a caretaker. They had placed their children in the presence of a force that did not need to prove dominance because it did not recognize the possibility of losing it, and the cubs were learning. The change inside the nursery did not fade after the echo of Mara's roar dissolved. It settled into the room like a new law of physics. The cubs no longer circled her. They studied her. Their tails lowered slightly, not in surrender, but in recalculation. Instinct was still present, powerful and unyielding, yet something had interrupted its certainty. For the first time in their brief existence, dominance had not been decided by force alone. Mara did not capitalize on the moment. She did not approach them or attempt contact. She moved with deliberate calm, retrieving a small container from her pack and placing it on the floor between them. The scent of nutrient gel spread through the chamber. Feeding time had arrived, and routine mattered more than spectacle. Her message was simple and unmistakable. Order would continue. Stability would not be negotiated. The cubs approached cautiously. Their eyes never left her face. One extended a claw toward the container, paused, and looked to her again. Mara inclined her head slightly, granting permission without words. The cub began to eat. The others followed, their movements still alert but no longer aggressive. Their bodies had accepted a hierarchy they did not yet understand. Behind the observation barrier, the parents remained motionless. The father's crest had flattened along his skull, an involuntary response to uncertainty. The mother's breathing had slowed into controlled intervals used during threat analysis. Neither spoke for several moments. They were not witnessing submission. They were witnessing stability imposed without violence. This is not behavioral suppression. The father finally said, his voice low. "No," the mother answered. "It is environmental dominance." They had no translation for what they had seen. Varethi dominance was always expressed through escalation, through measurable force. The human had achieved the same outcome through presence alone. That possibility unsettled them more than open conflict would have. Within the nursery, Mara observed the cubs carefully as they fed. Her posture remained relaxed, yet her awareness never wavered. She understood the moment was not victory. It was introduction. The cubs were not tamed. They were attentive. That distinction would determine everything that followed. After feeding, the largest cub approached her directly. It did not roar. It did not posture. It extended its head forward in a motion that resembled inspection. Its breath was warm, carrying the metallic scent of accelerated metabolism. Mara did not touch it immediately. She allowed proximity to exist without interference. When she finally raised her hand, the movement was slow and predictable. Her fingers rested briefly against the reinforced ridge above its eye. The cub did not pull away. A subtle vibration moved through its body. Not a roar, not a warning, but a low resonance that indicated recognition. The other two cubs watched closely. Their instincts recorded every detail. The human had not dominated them through pain or fear. She had established certainty through unshakable control of herself. The residence's internal monitoring systems continued to record environmental metrics. Acoustic pressure had normalized. Stress indicators within the cub's physiology had decreased. Yet a new variable appeared in the behavioral log: sustained attention toward the human subject beyond threat assessment. The system flagged it as anomaly. The parents understood it as influence. Hours passed without incident. Mara guided the cubs through structured activity, introducing movement patterns that engaged their strength without triggering confrontation. She redirected aggressive play with precise timing, using voice, posture, and stillness more than physical contact. Each correction was immediate but measured. She never retreated. She never advanced unnecessarily. The cubs responded not because they were forced, but because resistance produced no effect. The parents eventually entered the nursery, their presence announced through a controlled shift in lighting. The cubs acknowledged them, but did not abandon their focus on Mara. That detail unsettled the father, more than any display of force could have. "You did not suppress them," he said carefully. "I gave them boundaries." "They can feel," Mara replied. "They test pressure." "I gave them pressure that doesn't break." The mother studied her for a long moment. "You answered their roar with your own. Why?" "Because they speak in certainty," Mara said. "You don't negotiate with certainty. You answer it." Neither parent responded immediately. The explanation was simple, yet it carried implications far beyond childcare. They had assumed human empathy meant softness. They had mistaken restraint for weakness. What they observed instead was control refined to a degree their species had never prioritized. As the parents withdrew, the cubs resumed their positions near Mara without instruction. They did not cluster for protection. They aligned for presence. A quiet order had formed that required no enforcement systems, no commands, no displays of strength beyond the one already given. In the security wing, senior analysts reviewed the recordings repeatedly. Acoustic models failed to fully map the structure of the human roar. Behavioral projections for the cubs diverged sharply from expected developmental patterns. A recommendation was drafted for council review. It was classified at the highest level. Inside the nursery, Mara remained seated on the crystal floor, the cubs resting within arm's reach. Her gaze moved once toward the observation panel, aware she was still being studied. She showed no sign of tension, no indication of triumph. For her, the work had only begun, because dominance had not been established through fear. It had been established through something far more difficult too. Oppose. Consistency. And the cubs were learning faster than anyone had predicted. Word spread through the Varethi diplomatic network long before any official report was filed. It did not travel as rumor. It moved as data fragments, behavioral logs, acoustic readings, neural response charts from the cubs during exposure to the human caretaker. Every transmission carried the same conclusion without stating it directly. The expected hierarchy inside the nursery no longer existed in its original form. Something else had replaced it. The Varethi species valued dominance as a survival mechanism, but they valued predictability even more. Instinct could be trusted because it followed patterns. Strength followed measurable escalation. Fear produced compliance. The human presence had interrupted that equation. The cubs were not subdued. They were stabilizing. That outcome should have been impossible without force or genetic conditioning. A council observer arrived under the justification of routine welfare verification. The designation concealed the true objective. They intended to measure the human's influence directly. No external species had ever been permitted prolonged, unsupervised interaction with Varethi young. That policy existed for biological and cultural reasons. Both were now under review. Mara was informed of the visit without ceremony. She acknowledged the message and continued guiding the cubs through coordinated movement exercises. The activity required them to respond to her voice and posture cues rather than compete with one another. Their bodies were powerful even at early growth stage, yet their movements had begun to display restraint. They learned to halt mid-stride when she raised her hand. They learned to lower their roars when she shifted her tone. They learned that control did not diminish strength. It directed it. The observer entered the nursery, encased in a protective field calibrated to withstand juvenile aggression. The cubs turned immediately toward the new presence. Their instincts responded to unfamiliar stimulus with alert tension. Their tails lifted. Their shoulders broadened. The first rumble formed in their chests. Mara did not speak. She did not step between them and the visitor. She adjusted her breathing and allowed the cubs to feel the steadiness of her presence. The rumble softened before it reached full expression. The cubs glanced at her, not for permission, but for reference. The observer recorded the shift with visible surprise. "You exert influence without command," the observer stated. "I maintain consistency," Mara replied. "They align with what remains steady." The observer requested demonstration of response conditioning. Mara refused the term. She did not condition behavior. She provided an environment where uncontrolled reaction produced no result. The distinction was difficult for the observer to quantify. Their instruments measured physiological calm in the cubs when within proximity to the human. Stress responses diminished without suppression signals. The data suggested voluntary regulation. That finding conflicted with established Varethi developmental models. During the examination, a controlled disturbance was introduced into the chamber's environment. The test simulated sudden threat, a pressure fluctuation paired with disorienting sound. Historically, such stimuli triggered aggressive dominance displays among cubs, often escalating into conflict. The response this time unfolded differently. The cubs moved toward Mara rather than away from the stimulus. They positioned themselves in a formation that mirrored protective behavior rather than territorial challenge. Their bodies lowered, their roars contained, their attention fixed on her posture rather than the disturbance itself. Mara responded not with command but with stillness. She allowed the cubs to sense that no escalation was required. The simulated threat passed without a single aggressive display. The observer's instruments registered coordinated, neural patterns among the cubs that had never been documented outside mature hunting units. After the test concluded, the observer remained silent for several moments. Their field dimmed slightly, as they recalibrated sensors that had produced unexpected readings. This outcome suggests imprinting. They said at last. Mara shook her head gently. They are not imprinting on me. They are recognizing a pattern. Stability under pressure. That pattern is transferable. The observer transmitted a secure update to the council before leaving the chamber. The message did not recommend termination of the human contract. It recommended continued observation under expanded classification. Beyond the nursery, the parents reviewed the data in private. Their species had always believed that dominance must be proven repeatedly to remain valid. The human demonstrated something different. Authority could persist without constant reinforcement if it originated from control rather than force. The implication unsettled long-standing cultural doctrine. Inside the chamber, the cubs resumed their structured play. One attempted to initiate a mock challenge toward another, baring teeth and raising its crest. Before escalation formed, it paused, sensing Mara's unchanged posture. The challenge dissolved into movement practice. No reprimand had been issued. No dominance display required. Behavior had shifted through awareness alone. As the cycle progressed, subtle changes accumulated. The cubs began anticipating her cues before they were expressed. Their roars shortened, refined into signals rather than declarations. Their physical power remained formidable, yet it no longer spilled outward without direction. They were not becoming less Varethi. They were becoming something the species had never recorded. They were becoming deliberate. Late in the cycle, a minor structural tremor passed through the residence. A natural consequence of atmospheric turbulence around the gas giant below. The vibration triggered dormant instinct within the cubs. Their muscles tightened. Their breath deepened. The old pattern of reaction hovered at the edge of expression. Mara placed her palm against the crystal floor, grounding her posture. She inhaled slowly. The cubs watched the motion and mirrored it unconsciously, their massive chests rising and falling in controlled rhythm. The tremor faded. No roar followed. In the observation gallery, the parents remained still long after the recording ended. They had expected a caretaker. They had received a force that reshaped instinct through presence rather than opposition. What began as supervision had become influence. What began as influence was becoming transformation. And beyond the walls of the residence, the council prepared to decide whether such transformation represented stability or the beginning of a change no species could predict. The council's response arrived without public announcement. Additional observers were assigned to the Varethi residence under technical designations that concealed their true function. They were not there to protect the cubs. They were there to study the human effect before it spread beyond a single household. The Varethi had endured for millennia by controlling variables. Humanity had introduced one they could not categorize. Inside the nursery, change continued with quiet persistence. The cubs grew rapidly, their bodies gaining mass and strength each cycle. What should have been an increase in territorial aggression instead produced heightened awareness of boundaries. They no longer challenged every unfamiliar stimulus. They assessed. They waited. They responded only when necessary. Their instincts had not weakened. They had been given structure. Mara expanded their training gradually. She introduced coordinated movement patterns that required them to rely on one another rather than compete. At first, the exercises triggered frustration. Dominance instincts resisted cooperation. When one cub surged ahead to claim position, Mara did not restrain it physically. She withdrew engagement. The result was immediate. Without her attention, the exercise held no meaning. The cub learned that control, not force, maintained connection. The lesson repeated across variations of movement, sound, and proximity. Strength was acknowledged. Discipline was rewarded with presence. Escalation produced stillness that offered nothing to resist. Over time, the cubs adapted, not through submission, but through recognition that stability produced greater outcomes than aggression alone. Council analysts monitored biometric data with increasing concern. The cubs' neural activity displayed synchronized response patterns, previously recorded only among adult tactical units operating in coordinated formation. Yet there was no external command structure guiding them. The human caretaker's influence functioned through perception rather than instruction. To evaluate the limits of that influence, the council authorized a controlled exposure beyond the residence. A secure transit corridor was prepared. The cubs would encounter unfamiliar environments and stimuli outside their established territory while under observation. The objective was clear. If the human's presence alone maintained stability, it would persist under displacement. If not, the transformation would collapse under stress. The parents hesitated before approving the test. Their species valued demonstration. Yet instinct warned them that what had developed inside the nursery was fragile in ways they did not understand. Mara accepted the assignment without protest. She did not ask for assurances. She requested only that no automated suppression systems intervene. Unless physical harm became unavoidable. The transit chamber opened onto an observation platform, overlooking the gas giant's turbulent atmosphere. Energy currents roared beyond transparent shielding. Light fractured across the clouds below in violent patterns. For the cubs, the environment represented overwhelming stimulus movement. Sound, scale, unpredictability. Their bodies tensed instantly. Crests rose. Low-frequency vibrations formed in their chests. Old instincts surged forward, urging them to assert dominance against the unknown. Mara did not speak. She stepped forward and placed herself where the cubs could see both her and the storm beyond the barrier. She did not block their view. She allowed them to confront the immensity while anchored by her presence. Her breathing slowed. Her posture remained open. She neither retreated nor advanced. The first cub released a short, sharp roar toward the storm. The sound dissipated harmlessly against the shielding. No reaction came from the environment. No challenge was returned. The cub hesitated, confused by the absence of response. Mara inhaled deeply and exhaled through a steady vocalization. Not loud, not forceful, but unwavering. The sound did not compete with the storm. It existed beside it. The cub's attention shifted from the overwhelming environment back to her tone. Their vibration softened. Their bodies lowered slightly. They remained alert, but no longer overwhelmed. Observers recorded the moment as critical. The cubs were not suppressing fear. They were reorganizing response around a stable reference. That reference was not dominance. It was certainty. As the test continued, new stimuli were introduced, fluctuating light intensity, shifting gravitational vectors within safe parameters. Unfamiliar scents carried through controlled airflow. Each change triggered instinctual readiness. Each time, Mara's presence redirected escalation into assessment. The cubs learned to exist within uncertainty without attempting to overpower it. The council's internal debate intensified. Some argued that such influence posed existential risk. A species capable of altering Varathi, developmental patterns without genetic intervention, represented a force beyond traditional containment. Others argued the opposite. If stability could be transmitted without violence, it could reshape interstellar conflict itself. The parents observed the test from a secured chamber above the platform. They watched their young confront stimuli that had historically triggered dominance, displays leading to injury or death among siblings. This time, no aggression emerged. The cubs moved as a unit, aware of one another's position, aware of the human who neither commanded nor yielded. When the session concluded, the cubs did not rush back toward familiar territory. They remained beside Mara, their bodies calm despite continued turbulence beyond the barrier. Their instincts had not been silenced. They had been taught something older than fear of the unknown. They had been taught how to endure it in the hours that followed. A council directive was drafted, but not immediately issued. It proposed expansion of human observation programs across multiple species developmental units. The proposal carried unprecedented implications. It acknowledged, without stating directly, that humanity possessed an adaptive influence that extended beyond physical strength. Inside the residence, the cubs rested near Mara as they always had, their massive forms rising and falling with controlled breath. She remained seated among them, not as guardian, not as ruler, but as constant presence within an environment that no longer required dominance to remain stable. Outside the chamber, the parents stood together in silence. They had sought a caretaker capable of surviving their children. They had discovered something capable of shaping them and beyond their home. The galaxy had begun to notice that the change was no longer contained. The council did not announce its decision publicly, but the consequences became visible within days. Security protocols around the Verithi residence shifted from observation to containment readiness. Not containment of the cubs. Containment of influence. The classification assigned to Mara Vance was elevated beyond diplomatic status. She was no longer considered a caretaker operating within a controlled environment. She was now defined as an active variable capable of altering developmental outcomes in a dominant species. Inside the residence, the cubs sensed change long before any directive was issued. Their species perceived tension through subtle environmental cues, airflow shifts, vibration patterns in structural supports, variations in scent carried through circulation systems. The atmosphere beyond the nursery had tightened. Movement of personnel became more deliberate. Surveillance fields intensified. None of it was directed at the cubs openly, yet they felt the pressure of unseen attention. Their response was immediate and instinctive. They drew closer to Mara, not in fear, but in alignment. Their bodies positioned around her in a loose formation that mirrored defensive patterns observed in adult hunting groups. It was not learned behavior. It was adaptation guided by the stability they had come to associate with her presence. Mara noticed the shift without external confirmation. She had worked in high-stress environments long before entering this residence. She recognized controlled tension when she felt it. Her posture did not change. Her voice did not sharpen. She continued guiding the cubs through structured interaction, reinforcing consistency while the environment around them grew uncertain. The council authorized a new evaluation protocol. It was not designed to provoke aggression. It was designed to test limits of influence under perceived threat. A specialized containment unit entered the outer corridor adjacent to the nursery, projecting low-frequency pressure designed to trigger territorial response without causing harm. Historically, such pressure would have produced immediate escalation among Verithi juveniles. The cubs reacted as expected at first. Their muscles tightened. Their crests lifted. A deep resonance formed in their chests, the precursor to a dominance roar. Their instincts demanded assertion against the external force. Mara did not counter the pressure. She acknowledged it with controlled awareness. She shifted her stance, grounding her weight evenly, allowing her breathing to become audible but steady. She did not command silence. She demonstrated calm that could not be shaken by external influence. The cubs' resonance faltered. Their attention shifted from the pressure field to her posture. The urge to escalate remained, powerful and undeniable, yet it lacked direction. Instinct required opposition to define action. Her stillness denied that opposition. For several measured seconds, the cubs hovered between reaction and control. Then, one by one, their bodies lowered. The resonance dissipated into controlled breath. They remained alert, but they did not roar. In the monitoring chamber, council analysts exchanged silent acknowledgments. The data was conclusive. The human presence did not suppress instinct. It reorganized response pathways under stress conditions. That capability had no precedent in recorded interspecies interaction. The next phase of testing escalated risk. A controlled mechanical unit, designed to simulate unfamiliar biological movement, was introduced into the chamber. It did not threaten. It moved unpredictably, generating stimuli associated with prey and rival presence simultaneously. The objective was to create ambiguity, an environment where instinct alone could not determine response. The cubs surrounded the unit instantly, their movements precise and silent. Their eyes tracked every motion. The old pattern would have led to immediate dominance display, followed by physical engagement. Instead, they paused. They looked to Mara. She did not instruct them. She walked slowly to the center of their formation and stood beside the moving construct. She did not touch it. She did not acknowledge it as threat or object. She acknowledged only the cubs, meeting each gaze in turn. Understanding passed without language. The cubs did not attack. They did not retreat. They observed. The mechanical unit continued its erratic motion until its cycle completed and it powered down. No aggression occurred. No command had been issued. The cubs had chosen restraint because the environment, defined by Mara's presence, did not demand escalation. The parents watched the entire sequence in silence. For their species, restraint was never instinctive. It was earned through dominance hierarchies enforced over generations. Their children were demonstrating restraint without hierarchy, guided only by trust in a pattern of stability. When the test concluded, a directive was prepared recommending removal of the human variable for extended study. The justification was framed in neutral terms: analysis, replication potential, strategic risk mitigation. Yet beneath the formal language lay a simpler fear. Influence that could not be controlled could not be allowed to expand before the directive could be executed. An unexpected development altered the council's timeline. One of the cubs initiated contact with Mara without stimulus or challenge. It approached slowly, lowered its massive head, and rested it briefly against her shoulder. The gesture was not submission. It was recognition. The other two followed, forming a silent cluster around her. The monitoring systems registered synchronized neural patterns among the cubs once more. But this time, the pattern extended outward, affecting stress indicators within the residence itself. Environmental tension decreased measurably within proximity to the group. The council had sought to measure influence under pressure. Instead, they had witnessed influence radiating outward. Inside the nursery, Mara remained still as the cubs settled beside her. She understood what the observers did not yet accept. The change taking place was not temporary adaptation. It was learning embedded at the level of response itself. Beyond the chamber walls, deliberations intensified. Removal of the human caretaker would restore predictability, allowing her presence to continue risk transformation beyond control. Within the quiet center of the residence, the cubs rested in calm alignment around the one being who had never attempted to dominate them. And for the first time, the parents considered a possibility their species had never faced before. Strength could exist without fear, and once learned, it could not be unlearned. The removal order was issued in silence, sealed within encrypted channels that bypassed public council records. It was framed as a temporary reassignment for study, a neutral relocation that would preserve stability while analysis continued. The language was careful. The intention was not. The council had concluded that influence which could not be predicted must be isolated before it spread beyond a single lineage. Implementation required precision. The cubs could not perceive the action as threat. Mara could not be allowed to resist. The resident security network shifted to compliance mode, altering access pathways and sealing transit corridors with controlled efficiency. Environmental cues were adjusted subtly to avoid triggering instinctual escalation. To any observer, the structure remained calm. Beneath the surface, every system had been reconfigured for containment. Mara recognized the change. Immediately, she had lived long enough in uncertain places to sense preparation before movement began. The cubs sensed it as well. Their bodies stiffened with alert awareness, not because they understood the plan, but because they felt the tension embedded in the structure itself. They gathered near her without instruction, forming the quiet formation that had become their default state under stress. A council envoy entered the outer chamber accompanied by a containment escort. The envoy's posture conveyed neutrality, but the escort units carried fields calibrated for rapid immobilization. The message was delivered through formal protocol. Human caretaker Mara Vance, you are requested for reassignment under council authority. The cubs will remain under Varethi supervision. Compliance is expected. The cubs' reaction was immediate. Their muscles coiled. A low resonance spread through the chamber, deeper than any they had produced before. It was not the uncontrolled roar of dominance. It was a warning shaped by awareness. The escort units adjusted position in response. Mara raised her hand slowly, not toward the envoy, but toward the cubs. Her breathing remained steady. She did not move to shield them. She did not move to resist. She allowed her calm to exist between them and the approaching force. The resonance weakened but did not disappear. She stepped forward, positioning herself where both the envoy and the cubs could see her clearly. Her voice was level, without strain. You are escalating pressure in a developmental environment, she said. They will respond to that pressure, not because they choose conflict, because conflict is what pressure without context teaches. The envoy hesitated. Their species did not typically reconsider a directive once issued. Yet the data surrounding the human had already challenged many assumptions. The delay lasted only a moment before procedure resumed. Reassignment is necessary for broader stability, the envoy replied. Your cooperation will prevent unnecessary escalation. Mara did not argue. She turned slightly toward the cubs and lowered herself to one knee, bringing her posture within their direct line of sight. Her voice dropped to a tone that carried more presence than sound. Stay, she said quietly. The word held no force beyond its certainty. The cubs froze. Their instincts demanded movement, defense, resistance. Yet the pattern she had given them over cycles of interaction anchored their response. Stability did not mean absence of threat. It meant presence within it. She rose and began walking toward the envoy. The cubs did not follow. They trembled with restrained power, their massive forms held in place by a choice that instinct alone could not have produced. The escort units advanced to secure Mara's position. Their fields activated, forming a containment boundary around her. The moment the field touched her, the cubs released their resonance in unison. The sound did not resemble earlier roars. It carried depth that reverberated through structural frameworks, not as challenge, but as declaration of connection. Sensors across the residence recorded simultaneous response patterns within multiple systems. Environmental stress indicators spiked and then stabilized as if the structure itself adjusted to accommodate the wave. Mara remained within the containment field, unmoving. She did not struggle. She met the cubs' gaze steadily, allowing them to see that stability had not been broken. Separation had not erased presence. The parents arrived at the chamber threshold before security could restrict access. Their species did not intervene lightly in council operations. Yet what they witnessed was not aggression. It was cohesion under strain. Their children were not attacking. They were enduring. The mother spoke first, her voice controlled but edged with something unfamiliar. If removal disrupts developmental stability, responsibility lies with those who initiated it, she said. You have observed the data. You know the outcome of destabilization. The envoy did not respond immediately. They studied the cubs, then the human within the field. The expected reaction, chaotic aggression, uncontrolled dominance display, had not occurred. Instead, the cubs maintained formation despite escalating emotional stress. The human had not resisted. She had preserved order even in removal. Council procedure allowed reassessment when predicted outcomes diverged from observation. The envoy transmitted an urgent update. Seconds stretched into measured silence while distant authorities processed the information. Inside the chamber, the cub's resonance diminished gradually, replaced by deep, controlled breathing. Their bodies remained tense, yet they did not advance. They did not collapse into panic. They endured separation through discipline they had never been taught through force. The containment field around Mara dimmed slightly as new instructions arrived. The envoy's posture shifted. Reassignment is suspended pending further review, they announced. The field dissolved. Mara did not step forward immediately. She allowed the cubs to approach on their own terms. They moved with deliberate care, their massive forms surrounding her without contact at first. Then the largest pressed its head gently against her shoulder. The others settled beside her, their breathing gradually aligning with hers. Across the residence, monitoring systems recorded an unprecedented phenomenon. Environmental stress indicators fell below baseline levels, not only within the nursery, but throughout adjacent sectors. The presence that had stabilized 3 developing beings had extended outward once more. The council had attempted isolation to preserve control. Instead, they had revealed the extent of what they feared. Inside the quiet center of the chamber, Mara remained among the cubs, her posture unchanged, her presence unbroken. Beyond the walls, the realization spread through council channels with growing clarity. Humanity did not impose order through dominance. They generated it through unwavering stability. And once witnessed, it could not be unseen. The suspension of Mara's removal did not calm the council. Every predictive model they relied upon had assumed that separation would either trigger instability in the cubs or reveal limits to the human's influence. Neither outcome occurred. Instead, the attempted removal had strengthened cohesion. The cubs had endured stress without aggression, and the environment itself had stabilized in their proximity. The data no longer described an isolated behavioral anomaly. It described a transferable pattern of regulation that operated beyond traditional hierarchy. Emergency deliberations convened across multiple council chambers. The debate no longer centered on whether humanity possessed unusual adaptive capacity. That question had been answered. The conflict now concerned scale. If a single human presence could reorganize the instinctual responses of a dominant species young, what would occur if such influence expanded across military or diplomatic structures? Some council members argued that containment must proceed, regardless of short-term instability. Others warned that forced isolation could provoke exactly the uncontrolled escalation they sought to avoid. While the council debated, the Verithi residents entered a period of heightened observation. No overt interventions occurred. Instead, increasingly complex environmental variables were introduced to measure persistence of the pattern. Fluctuating gravitational pulses passed through controlled sections of the structure. Sudden light shifts altered spatial perception. External communications carried simulated emergency tones that historically triggered protective aggression in Verithi juveniles. Each stimulus was carefully calibrated to remain within safety margins while testing behavioral thresholds. The cubs responded with readiness, but not chaos. They gathered near Mara, not clustering in fear, but orienting themselves in relation to her steady posture. Their eyes tracked environmental change without immediate escalation. When pressure intensified, they mirrored her breathing. When unfamiliar sounds echoed through the chamber, they held position rather than challenged the source. Their strength remained evident in every movement, yet it no longer spilled outward without direction. Mara did not train them to ignore threat. She allowed them to experience it fully while maintaining internal order. She spoke rarely during these intervals. Her voice, when used, carried consistent rhythm rather than command. She did not reward calm with praise or discourage tension with reprimand. She existed as an unbroken reference point. Over time, the cubs learned that certainty could persist even when the environment did not. The parents observed with growing. Barethi young were traditionally shaped through controlled challenge, forced to assert dominance repeatedly until hierarchy stabilized. That process produced formidable individuals, but it also embedded perpetual readiness for conflict. The cubs under Mara's guidance displayed a different foundation. Their readiness remained, but it no longer demanded expression. They could wait. They could assess. They could choose. The implications extended beyond developmental theory. Barethi military doctrine relied upon immediate assertion under perceived threat. A generation capable of enduring uncertainty without reflexive escalation would alter strategic behavior at every level. The parents recognized the magnitude of that possibility before the council formally acknowledged it. To evaluate the human's influence under direct confrontation, the council authorized a final controlled scenario. A senior Barethi commander. The objective was not to provoke aggression, but to introduce a living embodiment of traditional authority. If the cubs recognized established hierarchy above the human influence, the pattern would fracture. If not, the transformation would be undeniable. The commander entered with measured confidence, their massive form radiating the biological signals. The cubs turned instantly, their instincts responding to the presence of a superior adult. Their bodies lowered, not in submission, but in readiness for hierarchical recognition. The chamber grew dense with unspoken pressure. Mara remained where she stood, her posture unchanged. She did not place herself between the cubs and the commander. She did not attempt to counter the presence. She acknowledged it with a brief inclination of her head, a gesture of respect without concession. The commander approached slowly, studying both the human and the cubs. Their voice carried resonance designed to command instinctual response. "You have altered expected behavior," the commander stated. "Explain the mechanism." Mara met their gaze steadily. "They are not responding to me. They are responding to stability that does not escalate when challenged." The cubs trembled with the force of instinct, urging recognition of superior dominance. They glanced toward Mara, not seeking permission, but seeking reference. Her breathing remained even. Her posture remained grounded. She neither opposed nor yielded. After several measured moments, the cubs lowered themselves fully to the floor. Not in submission to the commander, not in submission to Mara. They settled into calm readiness that acknowledged both presences without surrendering control of their own response. The commander withdrew their pressure gradually. Their crest flattened slightly, an involuntary response rarely observed by subordinates. "They are not dominated," the commander said quietly. "They are centered." The word carried weight far beyond its simplicity. It described a state the Barethi had never prioritized, yet now witnessed embodied in their young. The commander departed without further challenge. Their report to the council contained no recommendation for removal. It contained only observation. The transformation had occurred, and it had not diminished strength. Inside the nursery, the cubs resumed their positions near Mara, their massive forms relaxed yet alert. The encounter had not destabilized them. It had confirmed that authority did not require conflict to exist. The parents entered soon after, their movements slower than usual, their attention fixed on their children with unfamiliar contemplation. "You did not teach them to obey," the mother said. "I taught them to remain," Mara replied. "Once they can remain, they can choose how to act." Beyond the residence, council debate shifted tone. The question was no longer whether humanity represented a risk. The question was whether resisting such influence would preserve order or prevent evolution of interstellar relations entirely. Within the quiet chamber, the cubs rested in controlled alignment around the one presence that had never demanded their submission. Their instincts remained powerful. Their strength remained unquestioned. Yet something deeper had taken root within them, a capacity to endure uncertainty without surrendering themselves to it. For the first time in recorded Varithi history, dominance was no longer the only path to survival, and the galaxy had begun to understand that humanity's greatest strength was not force. It was the ability to stand steady when everything else demanded reaction. The Council's final session convened under emergency protocol, not because violence had occurred, but because none had. Entire strategic doctrines across multiple species were built on the assumption that dominance, once challenged, must escalate. What unfolded within the Varithi residence contradicted that belief at its foundation. The cubs had faced environmental threat, authority presence, separation risk, and instinctual pressure. They had not broken. They had not rebelled. They had adapted without losing strength. That outcome terrified the Council more than open war ever could. Reports streamed in from every observer node assigned to the case. Behavioral stability persisted. Aggression thresholds had not lowered, yet activation conditions had narrowed. The cubs did not react less. They reacted later, with intent, with choice. The data confirmed what the commander had already sensed. This was not conditioning. This was internal regulation developed through exposure to a presence that refused to escalate. The Council was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Humanity did not dominate ecosystems by overpowering them. They endured them. They absorbed pressure until pressure lost meaning. That trait, once thought to be a weakness masked as resilience, was now revealing itself as a force that could quietly reshape power structures without ever declaring itself superior. A vote was held. It did not concern Mara Vance alone. It concerned policy toward humanity as a whole. Containment was rejected. Forced removal was deemed counterproductive. Termination was never seriously proposed, though the fact that it had been considered left its mark on several council members. In the end, the directive passed narrowly but decisively. Human interaction programs would be expanded under controlled conditions, not to study dominance, to study stability. The parents received the decision in private. They did not celebrate. They understood that their children were no longer just Varithi heirs. They were living proof of a new developmental possibility. The future of their species would be measured against what their cubs became. Inside the nursery, Mara continued her work without ceremony. She did not acknowledge the Council's ruling. She did not change her routine. The cubs did not need explanation. They sensed resolution in the environment itself. The tension that had lingered for cycles dissipated. Systems normalized. Surveillance intensity decreased. For the first time since her arrival, the residence felt like a home rather than a testing ground. The cubs grew larger, stronger, more capable with each cycle. Their play evolved into coordinated training. Their mock challenges became exercises in control rather than contests of dominance. When frustration arose, they did not lash out. They grounded themselves through the patterns they had learned. They remained present. Other Varithi young began to visit under tightly regulated observation. The effect was immediate. Aggression dropped within proximity to the cubs who had grown. Under Mara's influence, not because the visitors were subdued, because they adjusted unconsciously to the stability surrounding them. The phenomenon spread faster than models predicted. The council issued a final classified summary of the incident. It concluded with a statement that would never be released to the public, yet circulated quietly among senior leadership across the galaxy. Humanity does not conquer through force alone. They introduce a variable that absorbs pressure instead of reflecting it. Prolonged exposure results in behavioral realignment without loss of capability. This influence cannot be countered through escalation. Within the nursery, Mara sat among the cubs as they rested after a training cycle. Their massive forms surrounded her, calm yet alert, powerful yet controlled. They were not dependent on her. They no longer needed constant reference. The stability she embodied had taken root within them, mooting them. The parents watched from the threshold, no longer anxious, no longer uncertain. They understood now what they had invited into their home that first cycle. Not a caretaker, not a predator, a constant. Across the galaxy, military planners and diplomats alike began adjusting assumptions they had held for centuries. The realization settled slowly but firmly into interstellar consciousness. Humanity did not roar the loudest, they stood the longest. And when the universe pushed hard enough to demand reaction, humans did not break, did not flee, and did not escalate blindly. They remained, and everything around them learned to do the same. Time passed, and the cubs' development accelerated beyond initial projections. The subtle shifts in their behavior were now undeniable to every observer, internal and external. They moved with precision, anticipation, and discipline, yet never with mindless aggression. Strength was present, yes, immense, terrifying in raw capability, but tempered by something foreign to their species: patience. Each decision was measured, each response deliberate. They no longer needed Mara to stabilize them. Her presence remained, not as a crutch, but as a constant reminder of what they had learned. The Varethi parents, once wary, now observed with awe. Their cubs had grown into beings capable of enduring pressure without dominance, capable of facing uncertainty without panic. Instincts that had demanded immediate assertion now lay dormant, replaced by strategic choice. Even the council's most skeptical analysts admitted privately that this was beyond prediction. They had never anticipated that a single human could impart such influence simply by existing within proximity. Mara continued her quiet guidance, introducing new challenges that tested intellect and coordination, never aggression. The cubs solved puzzles, navigated complex simulations, and faced unpredictable stimuli with grace and control. They had become models not only of physical power, but of cognitive resilience. Other species, observing from afar, began to reconsider traditional methods of training and leadership. The ripple effects of one human's influence were beginning to shape interstellar development in subtle, irrevocable ways. The council convened for a final review, though the outcome was no longer in question. Reports from monitoring stations confirmed that the cubs' behavior had permanently altered surrounding young Varethi. Behavioral patterns propagated through observation alone, demonstrating that Mara's methods, her presence, her consistency, had created a template for stability that extended beyond her immediate charge. Humanity had introduced a variable. Obodioiund of humanity had introduced a variable no algorithm could contain, a force no traditional authority could dictate. Within the residence, the cubs lounged around Mara as she calmly reviewed notes for the next cycle of their training. Their massive forms stretched across the floor, tails gently flicking, ears rotating in subtle acknowledgement of sounds and shifts in air currents. Their eyes followed her movements, not out of fear, not out of dominance, but in steady awareness. They were aware of their power, of their strength, and yet they were controlled by choice rather than instinct. The Varethi parents exchanged a glance neither could fully articulate. Pride mixed with unease. Their cubs were no longer just offspring. They were living evidence that humanity's influence could redefine the very principles of strength, control, and hierarchy. Mara's presence had rewritten what it meant to endure. Beyond the residence, across the galaxy, whispers began to circulate among species and councils alike. Tales of human influence on alien behavior, of restraint where only aggression had existed before, spread quietly but purposefully. Strategists debated the implications. Diplomats reconsidered old alliances. Military leaders pondered the impact of a species whose strength was measured not in brute force alone, but in unyielding stability under stress. Humanity had entered the interstellar stage not as conquerors, but as catalysts. As Mara watched the cubs settle into rest, she allowed herself a brief, rare smile. She had never sought glory, never desired authority, never sought to dominate. She had simply remained steady, and through that had achieved the impossible. The cubs, powerful beyond reckoning, had learned to endure, to choose, and to stabilize. She had taught them nothing by command. She had taught them everything by presence. In that quiet chamber, the galaxy's most fearsome species of juvenile predators rested peacefully under the guidance of a single human. Outside, the councils and strategists realized a chilling truth. Humans did not need weapons to dominate. Their greatest weapon was their constancy. Their strength lay not in aggression, but in endurance. And any species that underestimated them would soon learn that when humanity decided to stand, the galaxy itself would be forced to reckon with a force beyond expectation. The story of Mara and the cubs would become legend, a cautionary tale whispered across star systems. Humanity's influence, quiet and patient, had rewritten what it meant to wield power, not through conquest, not through dominance, but through presence. The cubs, once raw and wild, were now exemplars of controlled strength. And the galaxy had begun to understand something it could not ignore.